Federal law allows citizens to reproduce, distribute, or exhibit portions of copyrighted motion pictures, videotapes, or video discs under certain circumstances without authorization of the copyright holder. This is called fair use and is allowed for the purpose of criticism, news reporting, teaching, and parody, which doesn't infringe on copyright under 17 U.S.C. 107.
O Yahweh, open up you my lips, and let my mouth show forth your praise. Kuma, Yahweh, Wayaputso o Yaveka, Wayanusa misanecha mikaniacha. Kuma, Yahweh, Wayaputso o Yaveka, Wayanusa misanecha mikaniacha. Arise of you, O Yahweh. Let your enemies be scattered, and let those that hate thee flee from before thee. Let all of Yasharah, Yisrael, who love, worship, and praise Yahweh, give him thanks by saying Hallelujah.
Family, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Like, subscribe, and share this video. Hit the notification button. Become a member so you can get emails when a video comes out. When you hit that like button, the video spreads, and people need to know this. So if you have love for your brothers and sisters, hit that like button. So I chose this image because it clearly shows the way it is, the way it has been over the last century, and the way it should be over on the right. He rams before the flock. I don't need a man is code for I won't speak against my brothers. I won't snitch on them. I don't need a man is code for I won't speak against my brothers. I won't snitch on them. So let's get into leadership, and throughout this video I'm just going to let the brothers talk to you largely to get some understanding on leadership, and I'll have a special surprise at the end, so wait to the end to hear what one of our lovely brothers has to say about all of this. Jeremiah 50 verse 8 says, "Remove out of the midst of Babylon and go forth out of the land of the Chaldeans and be as he-goats before the flocks." So we see all the he-goats up here. So this is the scripture that we're referring to when we're talking about leaving the land of the Chaldeans, leaving the land of the Amorites and the Canaanites, and coming back into the promised land. Where it says, "You shall come out as he-goats as before the flock," the word for all of that, shall come out as he-goats, it's you'll come out with attitude. Basically, it's like you're going to come out with attitude. You're going to come out with the attitude of a ram or a he-goat before the flock, fully grown, as leaders of the people, chief ones, goats, rams. And the other interpretation is prompt and ready for fighting, a horse ready for the course. Speak softly and carry a big stick and you will go far is the African proverb that is depicted here and personifies the African Shemite or Yasharel as the shepherds, the leader of the flock. Traditionally, during slavery, women carried the burdens while men carried a big stick to fight off slave traders, as we see in this particular image, although the men are hidden behind the burden of these people fleeing in Africa. And there are times, of course, when men do carry the burdens as well in Africa, but more often than not, the women carry the burdens now. And we don't ever really see an image of women carrying the burdens while men walk alongside them to protect them from any threats.
Women everywhere suffer from back and neck problems, usually from heavy lifting during their daily work. Carrying water, wood, and older children for long distances can cause serious strain. Young girls who carry many heavy loads, especially water, have problems with the back and spine, that is their backbone. Their pelvic bones also develop poorly, which can lead to dangerous pregnancies later on. Carrying heavy loads can cause young women to suffer more miscarriages and can make older women and those who have recently given birth more likely to have falling womb, and that is prolapse. If you're in the habit of carrying heavy loads, be very careful.
So, this is what the image should really look like. This is the image of a leader. So, how do we get to the vision and reality of he rams before the flock as prophesied in the Bible? And did the men of Yasharel ever have intentions in the last 100 years to get to this ideal image of the shepherd and the leader who bears the nation? Today, the main question brothers are asking is, why are women saying they don't want to have babies anymore? And why don't they want to get married? And they're saying, we don't need a man. So I'm just showing you this beautiful image of a brother and a sister vibing together, dancing together in this dance of life as we explore the disunity that happened. And I've already done other videos on all of this. Now, a lot of Christian brothers are agreeing with Torah, but remaining in Christianity. Per scripture, they don't believe in polygamy, but do struggle with getting married or going with other nations. And obviously, many brothers agree with the word and follow Torah, but just may not know this information that I'm about to share regarding the reasons for all of this. What is very clear is that you are to love your neighbor as yourself, that there is neither male nor female, and you're not to ask anyone to do anything you wouldn't do yourself, which includes women if you are a man. In truth, contrary to what most of the African diaspora says, you're not supposed to just mind your own business. You are your brother's keeper. And as male leaders, this is the only way through accountability, which is very Christian. So let's look at a more recent historical account from Amiri Baraka in the 1970s when the brothers hoped to honor and have an ideal relationship with the women of the diaspora. When we look at the writings of Amiri Baraka, July 1970 issue of Black World, actually, I think it's quite a beautiful effort to try to equalize things. The original training, I think, is there, training in Yah. So he says, we talk about Black women and Black men like we are separate because we have been separated. Our hands reach out for each other for the closeness and completeness we are for each other, the expansion of consciousness that we provide for each other. So this is very much like the state of Adam and Eve in the garden before the fall, before Eve was... Well, when Eve was bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh, the womb of his man, right? But after the fall, she became Eve, right? She became something he dominated that was separate from him. And then in the law, in Torah, in Mashiach, man and woman, that's why it says there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, man nor woman. And I think it's kind of like the difference between Adam and Eve. It's now... They are now one again in Yeshua HaMashiach. So he says here, we were separated by the deed and process of slavery. We internalized the process, permitting it to create an alien geography in our skulls, a wandering spirit that had us missing each other
and never understanding just what it was. After we were gone from each other, my hand might rest on yours, and still you would be gone, and I, of course, not there, out wandering among the rogues and horrors of the universe. And so this separation is the cause of our need for self-consciousness and eventual healing. But we must erase the separateness by providing ourselves with healthy African identities, by embracing a value system that knows of no separation, but only of the divine complement of the black woman. The black woman is for her man.
So what happened? Well, lawlessness, of course, on the part of Israel first, and as to be expected, on the part of the enemy.
The black woman wouldn't be no hoe if a man wasn't no hoe. We made the black woman like the black woman is. We have sex with her friends, we have sex with her sisters. We're so disrespectful to us people, she got to put up with this shit. Our black sisters got to be the strongest woman it is on planet Earth. Why? She all by herself. She ain't got no man. A man don't know what to tell her, he can't talk to her. All a man's trying to do is have sex with her. She don't want to hear that, especially after she done had some babies and things like that. And the black man is sorry, he's not helping the black woman. He ain't helping his mama. So the black woman got a real hard job in America. She's our backbone, point blank. Hey, little boy ain't no man. Hey, man ain't no man. They all by themselves, struggling every day by themselves, trying to take care of this nigga here, his mama, by herself trying to take care of boys. My mama. All our mamas, they have a hard time and we don't even say thank you. We wrong. The black woman ain't wrong. The black woman wouldn't be no hoe if a man wasn't no hoe. We made the black woman like the black woman is. How can we disrespect the black woman? If it wasn't for the black woman, we wouldn't be here.
Read the rest of verse 4. And from the 7 spirits which are before his throne, and from Yeshua the anointed, who is faithful, who is the faithful witness, and the first begotten of the dead, and the prince of the kings of the earth, unto him that loved us, unto him that loved us, washed us from our sins in his own blood. Come on. And have made us kings and priests unto our God.
And made us kings and priests unto our God. Now, even though I'm not going into this right now, and I did it in a prior lesson, this is the reason we are not allowed to deal with polygamy as God's people. Okay? Why? Because kings and priests had a requirement to either be celibate or the husband of one wife. See? So what we did in the old covenant doesn't matter. He's calling us now to be a nation of what? Read it again.
And the prince of the kings of the earth, verse 6, and have made us kings and priests unto God and his Father.
And made us kings and priests unto God and his Father. Okay, priests cannot have what? More than one wife. And that's why I tell you in the New Testament that in order to be a deacon or an elder, you must be the husband of one wife. The kings and priests in the kingdom are not going to be polygamists. Okay? So we don't care what others do to try to claim that in the old covenant, okay, we were doing that. No longer is there a tabernacle to Moses or Elijah. Okay? It's all to Christ now.
Now we know that Judah, Samson, David, and Solomon went after strange women, and this is how the kingdom was lost, because Yah warned them not to go after strange flesh, because they go whoring after strange Elohims. And we know the women of Yasharel were haughty and prayed to Tamu, but Yah said he would not hold them accountable because the men went a whoring and after strange gods first. Men of the diaspora like to say women need to take a man with them to Africa to protect them, and why don't they just do their job and do that? But the main question the men of Yasharel are asking is, why don't women want to have babies anymore? Why don't women want to marry anymore? What do women really mean when they say, I don't need a man? Well, that is code for I don't want to speak against my brothers directly. But now it's time to spill the tea, because the burden is just too heavy.
In reality, black men are the most dangerous men to black women. So let's start by establishing some facts. First of all, the murder rate for U.S. black women is 6 times that of white women, and they have the highest homicide rate of any group in the nation. So higher than black men who are actually involved in gang violence and drug trafficking. Women are the most likely people to die. And who are they likely to die at the hands of? Their partners. This one's from Columbia, confirming the information. But I wanted to use this one from BET because you all can't say, oh, the evil white man is, making this up. What does it say? Killing our own. 94% of black women killed in a single victim, single offender incident knew their killer, and 93% were killed by another black person. You know who the most prolific serial killer in the history of the United States was? Bless my soul. It was a black man, Samuel Little. Murdered 93 people, almost all of whom were black women. They won't tell you that part, I'll tell you. But nobody was looking for him. Nobody cared, especially not these Negroes. But they have all the time in the world to warn you about the Ted Bundys of the world who aren't even looking at black women. Another multiple murderer of black women, Henry Louis Wallace. You heard of him? No. Chester Turner. Have you heard of him? I don't think so. Paul Duracell. Anything popping for you? And this man killed pregnant women. Have you heard about him? Nope. Some of the most gruesome and horrific crimes in American history, multiple crimes, have been committed by black men against black women. But what irritates me is men who have no intention of doing better by you, of treating you well, being angry when you seek better treatment elsewhere and want to use the specter of racism and our past to try to drive you into the arms of men who want to treat you worse. Here's one from Harvard. Homicide is the leading cause of death for pregnant women in the U.S. That's true of every racial group. But guess what? Black women are 7 to 11 times more likely to be killed, murdered during pregnancy. So I feel like it's disingenuous, some of the focus that we put on maternal mortality when we don't want to acknowledge the homicide rate. And quiet as it's kept, I feel like a lot of black women have bad maternal mortality outcomes because they are stressed for 9 months or dealing with abusive partners. But that part doesn't get put in the reports. Nobody wants to deal with that. I said what I said, and anybody who's mad can scratch their mad place and get glad. Because are you mad at Samuel Little? Do you know anything about the history of the multiple black male serial killers that have targeted black women? You don't, because you don't care to listen. You just want to spread this myth that we're somehow more in danger from other men. Most women, all women of all racial groups, are in the most danger from men they know. They will be unalived by their partners, not strangers. So that means black women are in the most danger from black men because most black women do not date interracially.
Now, I don't agree with all her stats, but I'm going to clarify them later. But the one thing that is true is that the burden is too heavy because now it's these who are carrying it. This child was classified as an African woman. Regarding the age of consent and adulthood, according to Scripture, the age of 20 is when you become an adult and can give consent as an adult for anything. And this is signified when you go and make an offering to the temple as one of Yah's children. And this is outlined in Numbers, Exodus, and Leviticus. So everyone from 20 years old and above was not allowed into the kingdom, and everyone under 20 was, because people 20 and above could give consent and understand Torah and could be responsible for their choices and decisions. Scripture says, Exodus 30 and 14, everyone that passeth among them that are numbered from 20 years old and above shall give an offering unto Yahuwah. Leviticus 27, and thy estimation shall be of the male from 20 years old even unto 60 years old, even thy estimation shall be 50 shekels of silver after the shekel of this sanctuary. And if it be a female, then thy estimation shall be 30 shekels. 30 shekels. So this is adulthood, and your body stops growing between the ages of 21 and 26. So this is the biblical standard. No need to invent or refer to anything else. The problem is the daughters, literally the children of Israel, are now bearing the sin burden of the men, spiritual, disease-wise, everything. The shedding of innocent blood is when you offer a child or person for sacrifice without consent, or when you practice rape or pedophilia on a child, and there is no remission of sins for the shedding of innocent blood. So today, because the polygamists are wanting to marry younger and younger for the sake of purifying themselves on the altar of the Virgin, now, especially in Muslim countries, young girls suffer from fistula, which is what happens when you give birth too young. Your whole rectum tears out of you in the birth process because your body is not ready to give birth. Even though your menstrual cycle may have come, it doesn't mean you're old enough to give birth. And praise Yah, His law tells us when women are ready to begin to be mothers. And we forget to consider that in the process of men marrying these young girls who don't have the emotional maturity to deal with these men, or the dangerous soul ties that may have come from multiple partners, homosexuality, pedo, or the various diseases they carry. These young girls and their purity are not the sacrifice through which the sin of these men should be purified. Yahusha is for that. That is idolatry and goddess worship.
Let me tell you something, yeah. I spent the night in a maternity ward. Whatever we're paying women, triple it. Triple it. Triple it. I'm sorry. Whatever we are paying women, triple it. Bruh, let me tell you something, yeah. The day you watch a child come out of a woman's private parts, if your life is not changed that day, then your life will never be changed. If you don't become a better person from witnessing that whole thing, there's no hope for you. There is no hope. Listen, yeah? Nature knew what it was doing when nature decided that it would be women who would get to carry the offspring. Because if it was down to us men, we would have gone extinct long time.
Another thing I must be very clear to mention is what Torah says about a woman's restoration and cycle. It is generally ignored when Leviticus states that a woman undergoing menstruation is perceived as unclean for 7 days, and whoever touches her shall be unclean until evening. So this means she can't cook, do any housework, do any work, because anything she touches will be defiled. So that means if you're following Torah, women have to have 7 days off every month. In addition, when after a woman gives birth, there are very clear laws as to how long she is to rest after giving birth. And this is something that made women hysterical, what they call hysterical during slavery, because they couldn't rest after giving birth. And it is also making women hysterical now. They cannot deal with the stress or pressure. They call it postpartum depression, but it really is a restoration period of 40 to 80 days that women need after giving birth. But we are forced to work all month, and we are forced to immediately look after children, even just a few days after birth. We're hearing things like the sisters are being unalived in Africa, and the only solution to this problem is to bring a man with you to have a man. This betrays a lack of awareness on the part of Black brothers that African American men are dating outside of their race almost 3 times as often as Black women are. So Black women are more loyal. Now, we understand that brothers do fear for their lives and they're in survival mode, but what about those who are doing well, the educated and the middle class? I'm going to cover plantation gender roles and early post-slavery history to get an understanding of how the roles of men and women were twisted. Of course, we already know about Deuteronomy 28 curses and how both would have an evil eye towards one another. But I will also go on to do a part 2 to cover post-World War II onwards. And then we will look at how agencies like the FBI, police, and CIA work together to destroy the Black family. But I want everyone to keep in mind that the men are masters of our demise and our grand rising, The he rams before the flock. If you are not leading us up, the men are leading us down. And that is how Yahuwah sees it. That's why Adam was blamed for the sin of the world, and Yahusha came to cover it. A man came to cover it. Because this is the nature of the leader. They lead everybody for good or for evil. The leader is a watchman, a husbandman who oversees and cares for the flock. A leader would have one wife, and he would be of Yasharel. And so you would be caring for your daughters, your sisters, your mothers. You would know their inherent concerns, needs, and the obstacles they face. If you're operating compassionately and observationally as a good shepherd and husbandman of the flock, you will be checking the flock for injuries, harms, and guarding them against all of those things. And so keep in mind as we go forwards, the question we want our male leaders to ask is, are you ready for leadership? Should you be positioning yourself for leadership if you aren't aware of some of the things I'm going to cover? And a lot of brothers are dealing with these things. There is of course, the men on my channel, right? But a lot of this information is out there, and it's been out there for a long time. So as we go in depth into slavery and the curses and the current situation, I'm hoping the brothers will please keep the overarching question of leadership of women and children and shepherding in mind. All right? Keep the question of, how am I going to lead? How am I going to hold my brothers accountable so we can escape this? All right? Because that is male leadership. I grew up in a time when men would punch each other and shake each other and say you're a drunk or you're cheating on your family. In the 70s, there were all these movies that would show that. And that was how men would keep each other in line. And so that is what the men are going to have to do today. And that's how Israel originally functioned. We are going to discuss the fact, truth, and reality that white women kept an overwhelming number of slaves. And through the daughters of the revolution, they were extremely involved in the oppression of Black women, equally so with white men. But we're not going to get into that right away. We're going to get into the history of Black men and women on the slave plantation. I prefer to say African diaspora. Sometimes I may say Black, but just please understand it's truly the African diaspora I'm talking about. White women's proximity to power is real. They occupy 26 to 27% of senior manager roles, 22% of senior vice president, CEO positions, and C-room positions, while Black women are grouped with women of color occupying less than 6 to 7% of these roles. Coupled with white men and women occupy 79% of upper level or CEO chief executive roles. The white woman is literally the plantation master. According to the comprehensive McKinsey and Company study in 2022, an overwhelming 63% of diversity, inclusion, leadership roles are occupied by white women. She is the plantation master for Black women and men. Well, I'm going to refer to Sojourner Truth's speech called Ain't I a Woman, so that we can learn how Israelite women were masculinized. I'm also going to refer to a book by Bell Hooks called Ain't I a Woman, which really documents a lot of this and documents how the strength of Black women became, and the balanced relationship that came out of being Hebrew people became perceived within a white patriarchal society as non-feminine. And I am not a feminist. This book, Ain't I a Woman, is called Black Women and Feminism because she really challenges white feminist views on the roles of black women. And she's not a lesbian, but I don't agree with a lot of her views because she's not coming from a Hebraic perspective, but she does bring a lot of history to the table of relations between black men and women pre-captivity to Babylon, America, and then throughout that captivity and into the 60s, and our changing perceptions of one another. And I think this is really important because my feeling is that the people of Israel have undergone a great deal of trauma. There is a well-known speech by Sojourner Truth called "Ain't I a Woman" from the 1700s. Okay, it was supposed to be delivered around 17 to 1800 within a 100-year span at a women's convention in Akron, Ohio. And this is what she had to say. "Well, children, there is so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. I think that twixt the Negroes of the South and the women of the North, all talking about rights, the white man will be in a fix pretty soon. So what's all this here talking about? That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man, when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most all sold off into slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman?" Then they talk about this thing in the head. What's this they call it? The audience whispers, intellect. That's it, honey. What's that got to do with women's rights or Negroes' rights? If my cup won't hold but a pint, and yours holds a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full? Then that little man in black there, he says women can't have as much rights as men, because Christ wasn't a woman. Well, where does your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. So here is the first example of an explanation of how the Hebrew women were masculinized as men. She plowed, she planted, her arm was as strong as a man, she could eat as much as a man, and she had to bear as much of the lash as a man. So this is our own sisters' reports on their sisters in Africa, okay? What Bell Hooks has to say in this book is that white male observers of African culture in the 18th and 19th centuries were astounded and impressed by the African male's subjugation of the African female. And this included polygamy. So not only this level of abuse, but there's also polygamy happening. They were not accustomed to a patriarchal social order that demanded not only that women accept their inferior status, but that they participate actively in the community labor force. Okay? So, in other words, quote, Gentile men were not accustomed to women doing men's labor. And they had been Christianized and were now reading the scripture. So when they saw this, they were amazed. And so here's Amanda Berry Smith's report on the state and the condition of African women. The poor women of Africa, like those of India, have a hard time. As a rule, they have all the hard work to do. They have to cut and carry all the wood, carry all the water on their heads, and plant all the rice. The men and boys cut and burn the bush with the help of women. But sowing the rice, planting the cassava, the women have to do. You will often see a great big man walking ahead with nothing in his hand but a cutlass, as they always carry that, or a spear. So this is for defense. And a woman, his wife, coming on behind with a great big child on her back and a load on her head. No matter how tired she is, her lord would not think of bringing her a jar of water to cook his supper with, or of beating the rice. No, she must do that. So we see here that the white male observers of this clearly saw they could enslave a people from this, observing these facts. So this is why the scripture talks about the Gentiles forwarding the affliction. They just basically easily spun the wheel in the direction it was already rolling in and forwarded the affliction. They saw the masculinization of the women of Israel by their own men. Israel enslaves themselves first. When we look at this, the women, what are they doing? They are planting the cassava, sowing the seed, and chopping wood. Now, when we look at the history of women in Africa, perceptively, we see that the men, contrary to the law, multiplied wives. Now, this is in a culture of enslavement imposed on the West. So these men are defending their wives. However, they are not sharing the duties with their wives. And in addition to that, they're still multiplying wives. So you can imagine the Gentiles now have the book, and they know that neither a king nor a priest should multiply wives. And they also know that men, they know the curse that was put upon Adam. And what was that curse? Well, in Genesis 3:17, unto Adam Yah said, because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree thereof, of which I commanded thee, saying, thou shalt not eat of it, cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow thou shalt eat of it all the days of thy life. So sorrow is, it's sawbone. And so it's in worrisomeness, in labor and pain, toil, hardship, shall thou eat of it. So ironically, since Adam was the primary protector of the garden and tiller of the garden, this was the curse Yah gave to him. And so why is he not working it off in this picture? Well, obviously, because of the slave trade, the men are protecting themselves and their women. But at the same time, there is no sharing in the work. And when we look at Genesis, we look at Jubilees in particular, we see that Adam and Eve did actually share their work. And there is no error in the women working this hard. It's just that the man is not doing his work and he's not sharing in the work. And this is the sin that obviously the Europeans saw. These men had already enslaved their women and were lording authority over them. It's about subjugation and submission. And I don't want you guys to get all confused and thinking that I'm saying that, you know, patriarchy is wrong according to the Hebrew Bible. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the white male concept of patriarchy was wrong. And that white men, even today, have difficulty sharing their power with their women, which is why their women are taking everything over now. But a culture that is based upon slavery, the enslavement and stealing of others, is going to be based on subjugation. And so its concept of patriarchy and male and female relationships must, by extension, be based on subjugation. So the white man subjugates the white woman, and both of them subjugate or oppress black people, and that's how their kingdom is built, on oppression. So this was a perfect opportunity for the Europeans, obviously, to take advantage of this broken relationship, this relationship of dominance and subjugation that had taken place between Hebrew men and women at this point. And so this is what the European men saw and thought when they saw this. They said, African women schooled in the art of obedience to a higher authority by the tradition of her society was probably seen by the white male slaver as an ideal subject for slavery. Much of the work to be done in the American colonies was in the area of agriculture. It undoubtedly occurred to slavers that the African female accustomed to performing arduous work in the fields, also while performing a wide variety of tasks in the domestic household, would be very useful on the American plantation. While only a few African women were aboard the first slave ships bringing slaves to the New World, as the slave trade gathered momentum, females made up 1/3 of the human cargo aboard most ships, because they could not effectively resist and capture at the hands of the thieves and kidnappers. African women became frequent targets for white male slavers. Slavers also used the capture of women important to the tribe, like the daughter of a king, as a means of luring African men into situations where they could be easily captured. Other African women were sold into slavery as punishment for breaking tribal laws. A woman found guilty of committing an act of adultery might be sold into bondage. So lust was also an institutionalized method of terrorism used against Hebrew women. Now we know it was used against men as well through sodomy. Okay, so we're not going to deny that. But these same things, identical things, happen to women, okay, as happened to men. Not only that, but the women were also dealing with the hostility of white women's jealousy about their own rape and abuse at the hands of the husbands of these white women. So they were dealing with an attack from white men and white women, and sometimes from their own brothers. Whereas the brothers were dealing with the white man, and probably some attacks from their women as well, but not from such a large group as the women were. So sexual lust was an institutionalized method of terrorism which had as its goal the demoralization and the dehumanization of black women. In confronting the black woman as an adversary in a sexual contest, the master would be subjecting her to the most elemental form of terrorism distinctly suited for the female rape. Given the already terroristic texture of plantation life, it would be as a potential victim of rape that the slave woman would be most unguarded. Further, she might most conveniently manipulated if the master contrived a random system of sorts, forcing her to pay with her body for foods, diminished severity of treatment, and the safety of her child, etc. So this was a real terrorism that the women were subject to, especially in the house under the gaze of their mistress and master always. Okay? And so violence and abuse by white women was often worse or equal to that of the men. And this was not something that African men suffered, okay? White women would have Hebrew women's breasts hacked off, their faces marred or cut, or lips cut off, and their children starved to death as punishment. Okay? Now, I want to recount some of the things that were done to the men, because in my work, on my job, everyone is so politically correct and pro-homosexual, and twice in the last 2 weeks, I've had to listen to young white people in their 20s say, yeah, it's so hard for black men to come out of the closet and be accepted as being gay, and the culture of Black people just doesn't allow it. And in both cases, I just freaked out. I just was like, I didn't freak out, but I just was like, look, I said, you have to understand that our people, our men were broken through sodomy and still are today. They were forced, it was not of our culture to practice homosexuality, although it was after coming out of Egypt, and that's why the law had to be put down. But it was not the custom of the Hebrews to have these practices, and so rape and sodomy of men was used to humiliate and break their spirits, and it was done in front of everybody to break everyone's spirits, the most strong and masculine men. And I said, this is the reason why we hate it, because even today our young men in their tweens and teens are put in prison and raped and sodomized, and they were in the past sodomized by white men, and even today prison guards and stuff. And I said, and then within the culture of the prisons, and that is why all the rappers and young men wear these sagging pants, because it's the same way they had to wear their pants sagging when they were on the plantations, and it is a reminder of that, and I would say that's why we hate it. And so I had to give that speech twice in 2 weeks, so or 10 days. So anyway, I did want to just give one account of this, which was actually in Brazilian history, which I found. I know there's a lot of them. I just don't want to repeat some of the ones that other people have done. And so this is from the book Slavery Unseen, Sex, Power, and Violence in Brazilian History, but we know all the same things were going on in America. And we're not only talking about America, we're talking about all of the slavery to the four corners of the earth. But here's a particularly awful story from Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, written by herself in 1861. The slave Luke was appointed to wait upon his bedridden master, whose despotic habits were greatly increased by exasperation at his own helplessness. He kept a cowhide, in other words, a whipping cowhide, beside him, and for the most trivial occurrence, he would order his attendant Luke to bare his back and kneel beside the couch while he whipped him till his strength was exhausted. Some days he was not allowed to wear anything but his shirt in order to be in readiness to be flogged, as this man lay there in his bed. And it gives a ... so we don't know what's in between there. A mere degraded wreck of manhood, he took into his head the strangest freaks of despotism. And if Luke hesitated to submit to his orders, the constable was immediately sent for. Some of these freaks, and this is where the word freak comes from, freaky, crazy crap, some of these freaks were of a nature too filthy to be repeated. When I fled from the house of bondage, I left poor Luke still chained to the bedside of this cruel and disgusting wretch. So that is how Black men were emasculated. But then the women were masculinized in a different way. While Black men were not forced to assume a role colonial American society regarded as feminine, Black women were forced to assume a masculine role. Black women labored in the fields alongside Black men, but few, if any, Black men labored as domestics alongside women in the white household, except for the possible exception of butlers whose status was still higher than that of the maid. Okay? So we see that there is a special kind of oppression coming down on Black women. In American society, privileged white women rarely worked in the fields. Occasionally, a white female indentured servant was forced to work in the field as a punishment for misdeeds, but this was not a common practice in the eyes of colonial white Americans. Only debased and degraded members of the female sex labored in the fields, okay? So the point of this is to say that women were made to do men's work, and even though women had done what patriarchs and the white patriarchy would call men's work in the past, it caused them to be considered masculine or male, not women. So they were masculinized. Conversely, men of the transatlantic slave trade, even though they were raped and sodomized at times, were not expected to take on roles or labor that a woman would take on, such as cooking in the kitchen or nursing a baby or cleaning the house or things of that nature. Although enslaved African women had labored in the fields in African communities, these tasks were seen as an extension of a woman's feminine role. Transplanted African women soon realized that they were seen as surrogate men by their white male slavers. On any plantation with a substantial number of female slaves, black women performed the same tasks as black men. They plowed, planted, harvested crops. And on some plantations, black women worked longer hours in the fields than black men, even though it was a widespread belief among white plantation owners that black women were often better workers than their male counterparts. How they're creating these emasculating rumors that women are better workers than the men. Only a male slave could rise to the position of driver or overseer. You see that in 12 Years a Slave. And you see the woman, can't remember her name right now, but she, massive amount of cotton, way more than the man. So the African man largely was allowed to maintain, even though sexually he could have been harassed or raped, he still kept the male roles, the male jobs, and resented having to perform any female tasks, okay, which is reasonable. Although both black women and men labored to pick ripe cotton, it was believed that the more delicately tapered fingers of the black female made it easier for her to gather the cotton from the pod. White overseers expected black female workers to work as well, if not better, than their male counterparts. If a black female worker failed to accomplish the amount of work expected of her, she was punished. But they did not discriminate in the area of punishment. Female slaves were beaten as harshly as male slaves. Observers of the slave experience claim that this was common on a plantation to see black females stripped naked, tied to a stake, and whipped with a hard saw or club. Same punishment given to men, given to women. When I was in my early 20s, the only place where I could get my history of our people was through reading novels of, by West Indian and some African, but primarily West Indian and African American authors. And I read Zora Neale Hurston, James Baldwin, Toni Morrison, and many, many more authors. But they really very well document the history of this oppression. And one of the things, now James Baldwin is somebody I suggest people read because he does a really interesting analysis through narrative of how this affected the black community. And one of the main stories that he writes is this book called Tell Me How Long This Train's Been Gone. And it goes into the sodomy and rape his brother experienced in prison, the predatory white men he found in his own life throughout his entire career who were always preying on him for sex, and also confusion in family relationships, in incest and predatory homosexual behavior. Some of Zora Neale Hurston and Toni Morrison's books go into what happens on the chain gangs and so forth, like into the Jim Crow era. We know that the brothers were often castrated when they were hung. There was always this ritual of castration. White women were mutilating black women sexually in the same way that white men were mutilating black men when they lynched them or hung them. And of course, as you go into the culture of psychology and anthropology in the Gentile institutions, you find that there is always this factor of saying that black women, just how it says in the scripture, women will rule over you. It's a consequence of the sin, because through the history of the transatlantic slave trade and the people of Israel, the Gentile nations, the dominant culture, the Amorites, have always sought to classify. They go into this new era where they begin to classify black women as having now castrated the men. So in other words, the Amorites, the Americans, and the Europeans literally castrated, sodomized, and raped our men, and then accused the Hebrew women of castrating men of their masculine identity. And so there's a lot of confusion generated. And among the families of the Hebrews, men and women were raped and abused by mothers, fathers, grandmothers, brothers, sisters. I mean, I have the most masculine, dark-skinned, good-looking brothers sit down with me and talk to me when I'm working sometimes, and they'll tell me about how they got molested when they were 3 years old, and repeatedly by one of their brothers or whatever. And they're straight, and they're, but it's just everybody's got a story. So so I think this is why I want to analyze this history a little more, about how Hebrew men and women of the slave trade were taught to hate each other and themselves and to devour one another. And this is again why I say that this is all trauma that people need to set themselves apart unto Yah for and purify themselves before entering into the garden, into the promised land, to do that time of purification, and to simply serve Yah until they are healed. Because procreation, it doesn't work well or correctly until people are healed. And I think in these camps and communities, they force these young men who've had these experiences. And I have to say, as I said before, I grew up with people who doctors, lawyers, their parents were from the West Indies and England and everything, and their sons wind up in prison and have this crap. My brother, my friends, brothers, two-parent families, everything should be okay, but they wind up in prison and subjected to this harassment and abuse within families, all of this kind of stuff. I've talked to some of my girlfriends about it, and it's like, I was like, you never talked to me about this. And it's because everyone was in hatred of one another, right? In competition with one another, crabs in a barrel. So I think the best way to deal with this is to set yourself apart and to counsel with one another about these things, and for people to talk very openly about it. And when these attacks are made on people of the transatlantic slave trade about not being pro-homosexual friendly or anything, we have to, I've done it twice where I just raise it. I will just literally be standing in a room full of people who are talking about this kind of stuff. Oh, black people are just not open to this. Men can't come out of the closet. And I will just recite this brutality. And it shuts everyone up. Because there's nothing they can say against it. Like I literally said, this is why our people hate it. Because our children, our men, even today, our young men are put in prison without cause and subjected to this. So it's hard to make an argument against it.
Let's talk about the Casual Killing Act of 1669. Virginia was still very much a colony, and it had a unique problem. White women, there was no such thing as a consensual relationship between an enslaver and the enslaved. So whenever he wanted it, he got it from whomever he wanted, be it male, female, enslaved, or not. And this pissed a lot of rich white women off, to have a husband who's no longer sexually attracted to you, but is out making 6, 10, 12, 15 kids with some enslaved African woman. So these white women would take out their frustrations on the bodies of these innocent children who did nothing more than simply exist. You ever watch Looney Tunes or Tex Avery cartoons and you see somebody get hit in the head with a frying pan, hit in the head with a rolling pin, had hot water poured on them, had hot grease poured on them, poke them in the eye, Three Stooges style. These are the things that rich white women would do to these caramel-colored babies. So many mixed-race babies were being killed at the hands of white women that something had to be done, because you couldn't arrest a white woman because that's just simply unheard of. So in October of 1669, King Charles II of England created the Casual Killing Act. Pause to read. In so many words, it says that any slave who resists his master, mistress, or overseer and is killed because you resisted correction, then the person who killed you gets away scot-free. And this was created in order to prevent white women from seeing any punishment from killing innocent black babies. And this essentially fixed the problem of white women killing black people. They could say that, oh, this slave resisted correction and died in the process of me correcting him, and they got away scot-free. Which is partially the reason why police say stop resisting. Because if you are killed for resisting their correction, and they told you to stop resisting, that justifies your death.
I want you to listen to the myth of the role of the white woman on the slave plantation. This brother is going to give us a sample of this mythology, and then we will listen to the actual book about they were her property, and we will hear exactly what the status of white female slave owners was and the power they had.
You see, white women had become a problem in colonial Virginia. Some were married young and were pissed off at the older men they were forced to marry. Some were frustrated from just being a woman in colonial Virginia. While most were pissed off at the caramel-colored babies running around their plantation wearing their husbands' faces. You see, slavery was a white man's sexual fantasy come to life. It was his own sexual playground, to do with these enslaved women as he pleased.
I like this guy, but why is he caping for white women? And would this be any justification for such insane conduct?
White women seldom saw slavery's most obnoxious features. They never attend slave auctions, never witness examinations, and seldom, if ever, see the Negroes lashed, he said. More profoundly, they didn't know that the interstate slave trade in slaves was a, quote, gigantic commerce, end quote. Southern men revealed only the South Side view of slavery, Redpath argued. And if the women of the South knew slavery as it is, he was convinced they would join in the protests against it. Redpath's assumptions represented a commonly held patriarchal view. Yet narrative sources, legal and financial documents, and military and government correspondence make it clear that white Southern women knew the most obnoxious features of slavery all too well. Slave-owning women not only witnessed the most brutal features of slavery, they took part in them, they profited from them, and defended them. Hearing what Redpath had to say, and after I read Redpath's Roving Editor, which was the book where these excerpts were taken, I immediately began to think about this particular kind of image of a slave auction. You get this impression that women weren't invested in the economy of American slavery, that they may have, in fact, been ideologically invested, they may have indirectly benefited from the labor of enslaved people that were owned by the men in their lives, but rarely, if ever, do we think about, and Redpath clearly didn't think either, about the ways in which white women were directly invested in the economy of American slavery, meaning that they bought and sold enslaved people.
Here's the truth, though.
And so, yet again, when we talk about formerly enslaved people, when we listen to what formerly enslaved people have to say, we come across accounts like Lit Young's. So Lit Young was owned by a woman named Martha Gibbs. And Martha Gibbs was this really spunky, twice widowed white woman. And when the Civil War came, she knew the writing was on the wall. She knew that her investments in slavery would be dissolved with emancipation. So rather than risk that fate, She picked up her most valuable slaves and she moved them to Marshall, Texas, hundreds of miles away. She not only moved them to Marshall, Texas, but she hired a group of white Irishmen, he referred to them as Irishmen, to guard them overnight so that none of them would run away. And she kept them enslaved a year after the Emancipation Proclamation was enacted. So they were enslaved for an entire year after slavery was over. And she only set them free because the federal government came and said, this is not okay, you have to let them go. So she finally let them go, but only after they had made her first crop in Texas. So Lit Young, this is Lit Young's account of what had happened to him, what he had experienced. They talk about the ways in which white women weren't simply these kind of wilting lilies that shied away from the violence and the horrors of slavery. These were women who had grown up in slavery. They had grown up in a culture of violence in which they understood that violence was fundamental to submission, fundamental to keeping African Americans in captivity.
Another myth perpetuated about the rights of white women over their property once they were married.
When Sarah got married, she gave up all autonomy, all rights. Anything that was based on her identity was gone and it merged into his. She had no legal independence. The slaves and wealth she inherited from her father and her aunt went directly to her husband, which means all of the wealth that he inherited from her, he had the right to do with it whatever he wanted to. So he had the right to own, sell, trade, discipline, profit off of, and dispose of however he wanted. She had no rights over her slaves. She could not perform any commercial endeavors without her husband's permission. As a matter of fact, Sarah's last free will decision was choosing to marry John. At this point, according to this doctrine, John controlled her body and her property. But in this chapter, we find out that is all a myth. It's just on paper and it don't mean nothing. Because Sarah and her ilk was out here saying, to hell with your laws, to hell with your doctrine, the slaves is mine, I'm going to do what I will, what I want, how I want, and it don't matter. These white women during the enslavement times were really out here wilding. So when we talk about women who were enslavers or women during colonial periods not having certain rights, understand this. They were able to bypass a whole lot. Okay, let's get into Sarah and John. Sarah and John had their own slaves. Sarah, she had hers all well kept, well nourished, well slept, well taken care of. John beat the hell out of his slaves and was like, y'all property, not humans. So when you saw John and Sarah's slaves, you knew whose slaves belonged to who. And so in chapter 2, we start to dive a little bit more into the roles that looked one way on paper, but was totally different inside the courtroom and inside the house when it came to women owning slaves. Sidebar. Throughout this chapter, they referred to slaves as property. Throughout this book, I have a feeling they're going to keep referring to slaves as property. When people talk about the Civil War was about property and not slaves, what do you think the property was? Women enslavers would put out ads to capture runaway slaves and how slaves were returned to jails, and it was the woman who went to collect them, the enslaving woman. They had different systems in place, and part of that was through antenuptials, aka the prenup. So let's learn a little bit about what these prenups included. It secured a way for women to have some control over their property. Now remember, the doctrine of coverture only took control of their body and their property. The antenuptial didn't give control over their bodies. So since they didn't have control over their bodies, they wanted to make sure they could at least control one thing, their property. In these nuptials, they forbade husbands to control their own property. They mentioned that they must consult with the female beneficiaries before changing anything in their estate. They granted women profits produced from these properties that they owned. They had the power to control, dispose of, mortgage, buy more property as they saw fit. So this is basically a counter of the doctrine of coverture. Now, the reasons they did this was for obvious reasons. You know, they were going to lose everything as soon as they got married. These prenups protected all of the assets they gained from their previous husband. And also it protected them against men who had multiple families out here. They were going to keep their coins one way or the other. These same systems that were put in place to allow white women enslavers to gain wealth, because the more slaves you had, the more wealth you had, showed a different side of the inhumane actions of owning slaves. So Mary Jane Jones was considered a nest egg who was gifted as a breeder. A slave husband was brought for her to breed children and to make her masters rich, or her mistress. F.H. Brown was the property of another slave owner, and she had 26 children for the Brown family. Throughout the entire plantation, before emancipation, the Browns owned 75 enslaved Africans and became a wealthy slave-owning family. On February 19th of 1844, an enslaved woman by the name of Winnie went to court over her freedom, because it was also important for enslaved Africans to know the law in secret to protect themselves. Winnie was about to be wrongfully enslaved, and her mistress put it in her contract that she wanted Winnie to be freed upon her death. Her stepson, who was over his father's property, knew this, but didn't change the language when it got time to go dish everything out. So Winnie took them to court, and he had no choice under oath, because, under oath, I guess they felt they were compelled to actually be honest. He admitted that he heard his stepmother talking about freeing Winnie. He was aware of the contract that was going to determine her freedom. And by having him as a witness, Winnie actually won her freedom. But don't get it twisted. It had nothing to do with his morality. He was going to make Winnie a slave despite her mistress's wishes. It just so happened that Winnie knew the law in secret. The chapter concludes by discussing how white women enslavers would war with their relatives, especially like there would be wars between mothers and sons, fathers and daughters, uncles and nieces over property, over enslaved people, and how these women would use these contracts to make sure that they would constantly have control over their property. They had to fight the patriarchy, but they were also winning. I really hated the concept of this chapter because of the way that white women enslavers viewed enslaved black people. It was all about not seeing their humanity. Like, how could you not see this trade, this thing that you're fighting for, your autonomy of your own body, your autonomy of your own inheritance? You can see that as worth fighting for, but you cannot see the fact that your inheritance is a human being. You can't see that you're separating families. You can't see that you are harming generations while you are building wealth for future generations in your families off of the backs of enslaved black people. And it frustrates me reading this chapter because I'm like, in order to get through it, you have to see it as just property. But then when you finish reading the chapter, you realize they're talking about human beings. They're talking about wanting autonomy and ownership of human beings while wanting to exercise their rights. This is why there is such an issue when it comes to womanism and feminism in our country, because they're able to separate themselves from the humanity of black people. I am frustrated. What are y'all thoughts? Let me know. Let's talk about it, because this chapter was almost as bad as the first one, which was about brutality. This is just about not seeing how you are gaining wealth and generational wealth on the backs of human beings. Let me know your thoughts, because I'm done. I'm just done.
He who owns the past owns the future. So the recapturing of the narrative of the past is crucial. And these women from the UDC, United Daughters of the Confederacy, are in there in the 1890s. They founded in 1894, 30 years after the end of the war. And they start with one chapter. 10 years later, there are 30,000 members of the UDC rewriting the textbooks of Southern state history. Anyway, it's a very fascinating link, and you probably know the other scholars working in that area after yours, but you've provided an extraordinary launch point for them to get going on this.
Thank you very much. Karen Cox, I think, her work is really wonderful around the UDC and, this the movement to kind of memorialize the Confederate cause.
Right.
Yeah, her work is really extraordinary around this subject as well.
Yes, and David Blight actually talks about it being written in stone because it was in the cemeteries.
Absolutely.
It was these stone statues, which are being toppled at this point for very obvious reasons. But it's really an extraordinary chapter that is made possible now from what we understand from your book. Thank you so much.
Something diasporan women also had to contend with in the antebellum society after about 1919 in World War II was, although their husbands did have their war pensions and the women were allowed to be stay-at-home mothers again and to raise up their own children, white people saw this and began to call the men vagrants. And when white women would approach black women to work for them and the women would say, "No, I'm fine, I'm good, I don't need work," they came up with this law to force women to look after the homes and children of white women. And this occurred in Greenville, South Carolina in 1918. So regardless of whether they want to or have to, able-bodied Negro women in Greenville who are not regularly employed are put to work, put in jail, or fined heavily. At its special meeting yesterday afternoon, City Council discussed the situation with regard to this class of loafers at some length, and it seemed that all members of the council agreed that some steps should be taken to compel them to engage in some sort of useful occupation. So this is the soft life that everybody talks about, stay-at-home mom, raising your own children, right? It was decided that an ordinance similar to the one now in force requiring all able-bodied men to work at least 5 days per week should be passed with regard to these women. Such An ordinance will be prepared and voted on at the next regular meeting of the council. A number of the complaints have come to the members of the council of Negro women who are not at work and who refuse employment when it is offered them. The result being that it is exceedingly difficult for families who need cooks and laundresses to get them. Wives of colored soldiers getting a monthly allowance from the government have a number of them declined to work on the ground that they can get along without working, according to the reports. Others have flatly refused jobs without giving any reason whatever, while still others pretend that they are employed when, as a matter of fact, they derive a living from illegitimate means. The proposed ordinance, I wonder what that is, living off your husband, maybe? Maybe making things at home, home-based business. The proposed ordinance will require them all to carry a labor identification card showing that they are regularly and usefully employed. The labor inspectors and police will be charged with the duty of rigidly enforcing this law. So basically, slavery all over again, even though these men went to war and risked their lives for America. So you see how both parties were hurt, but you see who gets hurt the most is the children. Who's going to look after these children or observe them when you've got all this extra work to do? I want to go back to Sojourner Truth's speech that she made, because she's entreating the white men, it seems to say that basically the black men in the South and the white women in the North, the white women are fighting for their rights, the black men are fighting for their rights. Nobody's fighting for the women's rights, which was actually true for black women. It was the daughters of the revolution, the white women, who actually made interracial marriage among white men and black women illegal, because black women were taking away white men. But there was definitely a very strong period in history when, after the plantation time and going into the 60s, 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s, that black men began to appeal to white women as brothers, and where black women were blamed for castrating the black male. And this is what can often happen with this scripture that says, and your women will rule over you. The false impression that is left is that Hebrew Israelite women are lording their authority over men, and they are the ones who castrated the men. But we have this very clear history of the white men castrating black men, literally. With manumission, then generally Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman were kind of an exception to the norm. But at public appearances, rallies, luncheons, and dinners, black male leaders spoke in support of patriarchal rule. They did not talk directly about discrimination against women. Instead, they had these romantic visions of black men lifting black women up onto pedestals, which is actually not too bad for a season. It was something that black women, I think, really needed at that time. And so then they moved into this idea of distinct sex roles and patterns for black women and men, specialized just like was in the dominant white culture. So it says, let our young men and women prepare themselves for usefulness in business, that men may enter into merchandise trading and other things of importance, and young women may become teachers of various kinds and otherwise places of usefulness. Our females must be qualified because they are to be mothers of our children. As mothers are the first nurse and instructors of children. From them, children consequently get their first impression, which being always the most lasting should be more correct. Raise the mothers above the level of degradation, and the offspring is elevated with them. Now, some more of the book, page 90, goes into the black male activists like Douglass, Booker T. Washington, and so on, being against their wives helping with activism. But of course, oftentimes, obviously, black women were very strong at influence in activism historically. So there are so many black women who have forwarded the cause. And so again, it was something imposed by the Europeans to not have this kind of equality in the garden, with the man having the last say, but not behaving with an attitude of dominion or domination over the woman. African-American Calvin Chase wrote an editorial in B titled Our Women, which he urged Black men to assume the role of protector of Black womanhood, and he admonished, let us do our duty by defending our women. Let us set up a system of reformation not only of our women, but everything that pertains to the race's advancement. And so 19th century leaders like James Forten, Charles Redmond, Martin Delany, Frederick Douglass supported the efforts of women to gain political rights, but they did not appear to support social equality. And of course, there's a white writer who says, Southern racists and Black activists looked at women in similar terms. Both viewed the female as a second sex with distinctly limited privileges. So you can see that there was, first of all, that's creating a schism between the men and the women, and the men actually wanting to protect women by making a statement by that, a white author. But at the same time, it does show that to a certain degree, the men were learning the ways of the Gentiles. But at the same time, they had come out of this terrible period of slavery and were coming into a Renaissance period. And so they were seeking to do things the best way that they could. So I think it's best to look at the good intentions, but to be on guard against this unbalanced dynamic again. The men not being able to fully access the power of their women because it's submitted to this Gentile or European concept of what male and female roles should be, which ultimately was based on slavery. So it's going to be based on oppression and dominion. And so it can never be right. When we look at the writings of Amiri Baraka, July 1970 issue of Black World, it actually, I think it's quite a beautiful effort to try to equalize things. Of course, Bell Hooks regards it as a way of establishing a Black patriarchy, which when we read a little further is actually true, but the good sentiment of the original training, I think, is there, training in Yah. So he says, we talk about Black women and Black men like we are separate because we have been separated. Our hands reach out for each other for the closeness and completeness we are for each other, the expansion of consciousness that we provide for each other. So this is very much like the state of Adam and Eve in the garden before the fall, before Eve was... well, when Eve was bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh, the womb of his man, right? But after the fall, she became Eve, right? She became something he dominated that was separate from him. And then in the law, in Torah, in Mashiach, man and woman, that's why it says there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, man nor woman. And I think it's kind of like the difference between Adam and Eve. It's now... they are now one again in Yeshua HaMashiach. So he says here, we were separated by the deed and process of slavery. We internalized the process, permitting it to create an alien geography in our skulls, a wandering spirit that had us missing each other and never understanding just what it was. After we were gone from each other, my hand might rest on yours and still you would be gone, and I, of course, not there, out wandering among the rogues and whores of the universe. And so this separation is the cause of our need for self-consciousness and eventual healing. But we must erase the separateness by providing ourselves with healthy African identities, by embracing a value system that knows of no separation, but only of the divine complement of the Black woman. The Black woman is for her man. For instance, we do not believe in the equality of men and women. We cannot understand what the devils and the devilishly influenced mean when they say equality for women. We can never be equals. Nature has not provided thus. The brother says, let a woman be a woman, let a man be a man. So this is a honest representation of the truth, although a little bit skewed, because wives are submit to their husbands and husbands are submit to their wives. They're to submit to one another, but the husband is the end authority. And that's why you can't have it both ways. You must understand that. And that is why Adam is blamed for the sin of the world and not Eve. And so if you say you want to be the final authority, then you must accept that. If you want to blame Eve for the sin of the world, then you must accept that you are completely equal and her authority is equal to yours, which is not scriptural. Okay? But you are equal in Yeshua HaMashiach, but still the man is a type of Christ over the church, or Mashiach over the church, or Yah over the Son. The Son does everything the Father wills him to do, but it's not because one is inferior, but their roles are different. So I'm going to do a part 2 on this. I'm going to look at Black athletes, entertainers, actors, and musicians as spokesmen and leaders and how that impacted the African diasporan community, family. We're going to look at identity, COINTELPRO, P. Diddy operatives that were deployed to destroy the community, in addition to, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, how they fit into that picture around the Black Messiah. We're going to look at the war on drugs and welfare, how drugs like Coca-Cola and heroin and the AIDS epidemic, as well as the petrodollar and engineered recessions, impacted the perspective of the African diaspora on one another. So, and we'll also look at what the scripture says, has to say about these end times and entering into the kingdom. So I hope you'll join me for that. Find that, of course, the brothers abandon the sisters to engage in a seed war with white men. And the impact it has on Black women and children, on the women and children of the diaspora. So we'll take a look at that and then where we need to go from here. I think a lot of that is already in this, but I look forward to seeing you in the next one, family. Hope you guys like this, found it informative. This is more documentary, let's say, than a biblical teaching, but it's important that this information is conveyed so that there will be greater understanding between men and women. I hope the brothers have learned something from this. We understand that you're basically suffering from Stockholm Syndrome. A lot of people are in the diaspora, but I hope this has given you some ideas about what needs to be addressed and in terms of the particular mechanisms that worked against each sex. So regarding P. Diddy and all of the charges against him, especially him dragging his wife in that hotel, and who knows what happened to Kim Porter, I just want to give thanks for this brother's position and attitude and just affirm the real men in Israel and just have a listen to what he says.
Why is this video out right now? This video is from years ago. You mean to tell me the hotel staff, the security, and all these people, none of them said anything about this video that you can clearly see somebody, I don't know if it's P. Diddy, you see a man dragging a woman up the hall, throwing vases at her and shit, and nobody says nothing until now? And you want me to think that P. Diddy is just a sick when nobody said nothing? This woman is cowering on the floor, balling up, getting stumped out, and somebody saw that on the video, and the only time you're going to say something about it is when Cassie give a lawsuit? This nigga has been telling the black community to vote or die, because he's a Democrat pawn, and that's why he was able to goddamn run around here like that. A Democrat little boy that beat up women and do all this well, I ain't going to go that far, do all this punk shit, and now everybody's supposed to be scared of him because he can hire somebody else? You niggas that's been following this man, protecting this man, you guys are sick just like he is. If that's him in that video, and all of you men that's in that circle talking about take that, and all that monkey ass shit, all you niggas sicker than them. Because all of this shit has been known. This is how our community is so dysfunctional. They see this type of shit going on, and nobody say nothing. Nobody don't say nothing. This man is a mogul, and this is allegedly him on a video dragging a woman up the damn hallway, and y'all telling me that it ain't some black people that's living just as good as white people? He did worse than Dana White. I'm talking about Dana White this whole time. Dana White slapped his wife 2 times. This motherfucker stomping people up the goddamn hallway, dragging them, throwing shit at them. I'm looking at this video like, what the? And the first thing that came to my mind is, how is somebody this visible, this famous, with this much money getting away with that type of shit? And I said, Kwame, why are you so surprised, boy? You've been right this whole time. This is why they so mad at you. You've been 100% right this whole time, boy. For the right person, they always look the other way. Yeah, for the right person, they're going to look the other way. And it's sad. It's a sad day. I'm more mad at the people who saw the video years ago and never did nothing. That hotel should be boycotted. Just P. Diddy. That hotel should be closed. It shouldn't be one black woman that go in that goddamn hotel and feel safe. Because you mean to tell me they got a footage of somebody whooping a woman's ass and dragging her up the goddamn hallway and throwing vases at her, and no hotel security said nothing? All of the hotel security staff should be fired. The hotel security should be the hotel should be added in that lawsuit. How do you protect a situation like that? And then now we all supposed to be only up in arms about P. Diddy when somebody has to enable this guy to do this shit. How did this take so long to come out? And if Cassidy never brought up that lawsuit, this nigga would still be at the take that parties. Man, I'm out of here. I got a graduation to go to. I told y'all, it's a go along, get along gang, and these niggas will look the other way for the person they like and the person that put some squilla in their pocket. That's all to it. That's it. That's all. Ain't no such thing as no goddamn black unity. It ain't no such thing as unity, period. You better mind yourself, mind your business, and take care of your family, because that's all you got. These other motherfuckers out here in the world, they'll look the other way. If somebody kicking my ass, ain't none of my brothers gonna look the other way. Somebody kicking my ass, all the people that love me, they ain't gonna look the other goddamn way. So that's who I goddamn look out for and rock out with. The rest of this shit is all phony to me. Y'all have a blessed day. I'm up out of this.
So then why they out to get him now?
I hope you'll join me for the next one, and thank you so much for watching, and thanks for all of your support. I really appreciate it. I wouldn't be able to do the work that I do without your support, and most of all, it's a great encouragement. I really appreciate you, and I appreciate those who are like-minded in Yahushua HaMashiach. Baruch to you. Shalom. Family, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Like, subscribe, and share this video. Hit the notification button, become a member so you can get emails when a video comes out. When you hit that like button, the video spreads and people need to know this. So if you have love for your brothers and sisters, hit that like button. I encourage you, family, to go to my website, Into All Truth, and go ahead and get yourself the calendar. Go to the Into All Truth shop and get yourself the calendar or the lifestyle book, which has great recipes in it for health. And of course, I updated some of the products on the site to reflect what's on my Teespring store. So go ahead and click through to my Teespring shop to don the colors of the priesthood, because you're a kingdom of priests. Check out these products. They're not that expensive. This is in Canadian funds. So think of this as 30% off, because that's the exchange rate. May Yah bless you and keep you and cause his face to shine on you. May he be gracious, lift the light of his countenance, and give you shalom. But please continue to support. Go to intoalltruth.net and sign up for membership, or just become a subscriber. Pick up the lifestyle book or the calendar so you can keep these appointed times. May Yah bless you and keep you and cause his face to shine on you. May he be gracious, lift the light of his countenance, and give you shalom.
Let those that hate thee flee from before thee. Let all of Yasharah, Yisrael, who love, worship, and praise Yahweh, give him thanks by saying hallelujah.